This program is brought to you by Emory University.
The story of baseball in America is part of the larger story of civil rights. Tentative steps toward racial equality in the late 19th century, then a hardening of white attitudes and a half-century of segregation, and the creation of a multitude of separate but equal institutions for African Americans. And finally, beginning at about the end of World War II, decisive progress toward a fully integrated society. The first documented game involving an African American club took place in 1859, but doubtless there were earlier contests. Integrated games also were played at about this time, whether between integrated clubs or involving black teams playing white teams. These contests don't seem to have been regarded as unusual. College intervarsity games were organized in the 1870s, but college teams were assembled as early as the 1860s, and some of these also were integrated. Racial lines in baseball didn't harden until relatively late in the 19th century, and this was in keeping with the increasing segregation in America at that time. Professional baseball didn't start out officially segregated, although club teams in the early years tended to be composed either of all white players or all blacks. In Philadelphia in 1867, Jacob C. White, Jr. and Octavius C. Cato founded the nation's first all-black baseball club, the Pythians. But the club was blocked from joining the National Association of Baseball Players. They did play against white teams. In the 1880s, African American players such as J. W. Bud Fowler from Lynn, Massachusetts Live Oaks, and Moses Fleet Walker, played for the Toledo Blue Stockings, played baseball for money alongside their white teammates. To be sure, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, there weren't many African Americans on the rosters of organized baseball, and the evidence is that the few who did play were not welcomed with enthusiasm. But several changes during the late 19th century in the composition and attitudes of American society, especially urban environments where professional baseball was most often played, contributed to national segregationist attitudes and to the creation of Jim Crow legislation, either in fact or in effect. As early as 1871, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players excluded black players. The Supreme Court ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which upheld individual state segregation laws, authorized the doctrine of separate but equal as the law of the land for more than 50 years, until it was finally overturned by Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. Within baseball, blacks were eventually excluded because of the overt racism of some of the game's most influential players and owners. One of these was Hall of Fame player Adrian Cap, short for Captain, Anson. He was a first baseman, later manager and part owner of the Chicago White Stockings. More than once, Anson refused to take the field when the opposing team included African American players. Anson's bigotry was probably less influential than it was typical of contemporary attitudes in organized baseball, as well as American culture at the time as a whole. Another contributing factor at this time was the growing urban population of European immigrants and Southern African Americans who began to move to northern cities in ever-increasing numbers. Racial antagonisms between these two diverse groups were perhaps inevitable and were made worse by factory and business owners who sometimes hired African Americans to replace striking members of their regular labor force. Just as segregation took more than a generation to take hold in most parts of America, so the transition to an integrated society didn't take place overnight. World War II contributed to Americans' growing uneasiness, if not outright revulsion, at their own racial practices. The exposure of Nazi atrocities made it clear how easily racial bigotry could metastasize across a society. Important, too, was the increased mobility brought to Americans thanks to the automobile, and especially brought about by the war. Thousands of Northern soldiers and civilians relocated temporarily to the Deep South saw for the first time the injustice and inhumanity of segregation. I have to say it was a shock to me as an adolescent to travel to the American South and to see firsthand the evidence of segregation. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that anyone who grew up, say, in Massachusetts or Ohio at that time was automatically free of any racial prejudice, nor am I saying that all Mississippians were closed-minded racists. Northerners' view of the American South in the pre-civil rights era was a subtle mix of righteous abhorrence and smug condescension. Of course, the South was in many ways a racist culture, but sometimes to focus on the excesses of Southern racism often made it easier for a person from New York or Philadelphia to overlook the beam in his own eye. Integration came to baseball in a sense because it was time, historically speaking. Because baseball in the years immediately after World War II was still widely recognized as the national game, to integrate the sport was of huge symbolic importance. A brief timeline of integration in America shows that baseball was first in 1947. President Truman's executive order to integrate the armed services was issued in 1948. The integration of schools, colleges, restaurants, buses, swimming pools, and country clubs, these all came later. Baseball was first. But no change comes without human agents, and the three most important agents of this change in baseball were Branch Rickey, general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, selected by Rickey to be the first African American to play Major League Baseball, and A.B. Happy Chandler, who was named Commissioner of Baseball in 1945, following the death of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Chandler, Rickey, and Robinson are the heroes of this story. Here is Chandler, speaking one of the finest things ever said about baseball, if not about America. These are Chandler's words. "If the Lord made some people black, and some white, and some red or yellow, he must have had a pretty good reason. It isn't my job to decide which colors can play big league baseball. It's my job to see that the game is played fairly and that everybody has a chance. I think if I do that, I can face my maker with a clear conscience." One other important factor must be noted in contributing to the integration of baseball: the desire to win. The great pitcher Dizzy Dean, a member of the St. Louis Cardinals' Gas House Gang, and the last Major League pitcher to win 30 games in a single season, he did it in 1934, Dean once said that if the Cardinals were to hire Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige from the Negro Leagues, two stars of those leagues, if they were to hire those players, they could win the pennant by the 4th of July and spend the rest of the summer fishing and waiting for the World Series. Dean exaggerated, of course, but his remark shows both that players in Major League Baseball knew about the high quality of play in the Negro Leagues and keenly assessed the impact players like Gibson, Page, Cool Papa Bell, and scores of others would have if they were permitted to play. Dean's quip reminds me of something the great Boston Celtics center Bill Russell once said when he was asked how many black players it was the custom to use during a game. According to Russell, the unwritten custom at that time in the NBA was for teams to play 1 at home, 2 on the road, and 3 when you're behind. The remarkable run of success enjoyed by the Brooklyn Dodgers during the decade following the end of World War II, 6 National League pennants, 1 World Series championship, tends to provide subtle evidence that Dean knew what he was talking about.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.